Welcome to the Visually Hidden Selects podcast, where we discuss an independent approach to the art of cinema and explore the subtext of various featured films. My name is Peter O'Brien, and I am an independent filmmaker, author, and musician.
My name is Bendler. I'm a film and stage actor and a pop culture enthusiast.
I'm Anne Milleville, a French screenwriter and producer.
This week's VHS selection is Frankenstein from 1931, directed by James Whale and starring Colin, Clive, and Boris Karloff. If you have not seen Frankenstein, then please head over to the Visually Hidden YouTube channel, subscribe so you don't miss any future recommendations, check out the VHS video, watch the film, and then come on back to the podcast because we will be discussing it openly with spoilers. Here we go. Frankenstein is really kind of not the granddaddy of horror films, but it kind of is the granddaddy of horror stories. You know, the novel was first published in 1818, and it was a stage play that was then adapted into film. This film has a lot more in common with the stage play than it does with the novel, insofar as like the beats and what the story follows and everything. But it's been around for pretty much forever. And so I remember when I was a little kid, I was watching television and Young Frankenstein came on, and I thought I was watching Frankenstein. Like, I was like, oh sweet, I'm watching a scary movie. This is awesome. This is Frankenstein. You know, because like you always see him at Halloween. He's just a big icon of horror and of especially the spooky season that we're heading into now. So I was, I couldn't read. I was like 4, but I saw the castle and I saw the lab, and then I came to realize this isn't Frankenstein. This is silly and this is funny, but it's still awesome and it's still Frankenstein. It's related. To me, it's always going to be the third in the trilogy. That's a conversation for another day. Frankenstein really kind of came to me probably initially through the film Weird Science, the John Hughes film. And then I found the original and I watched, and I have VHS and then DVD and on down the line, where Frankenstein is really probably my favorite of the original Universal monsters, probably even my favorite of the classic monsters. When you get right down to it, there's so much in this film and in this story that I enjoy. I was lucky enough to see this in the movie theater, and coincidentally, Stephen Bendler was there with me.
Yeah. I think I saw this movie for the first time in high school. I went on this quest to watch all these movies that I had either seen parts of or had heard great things about but never had seen. Plus, it's my mom's favorite of the monsters, so I was like, let me go check this out again. And the movie, it's so good, and it's a bona fide 1000% classic film.
And for me, it was the first time I watched it. Of course, I knew about it. I knew about the legend of this movie, but I didn't know that Frankenstein wasn't the monster itself. I thought it was. So I discovered it today. It's never too late. And the fact that it's in black and white, yeah, it always bothers me when it's in black and white. I must say that the fact that I was really curious to watch it, and actually it's pretty good on screen. I mean, I was really surprised about the quality for its time. Really, I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed watching this movie. It's really surprising in the 30s that they did something like that. So yeah, thank you for the discovery.
You keep saying that you don't really like black and white movies, and yet every single one we watch you like.
I was sure.
You like more than some of the color movies, some of the special effects movies.
It's your talent.
You seem to gravitate towards this black and white presentation, and I'm baffled. I'm truly confused.
Only stupid people never change their mind,
Well, that's flattering, but...
Anne says that she doesn't like horror movies and she doesn't like black and white movies, and this is the double shot.
Yeah, and she doesn't like old movies. I don't get it. You're an enigma, Anne. You're a mystery wrapped in a riddle in another language. I think one thing that always really stood out to me about this particular film is the running time. This film is only like 70-ish minutes long. It's super tight. It really just jumps right in with them robbing the grave. There's no like, oh, I have an idea for, I'm going to create life and I'm going to do this. Like, no, this one just hits the ground running. They're already in the cemetery, digging up the first body and then moving on to the lab. And I think that's one thing that really makes this film stand out and really makes it accessible like almost 100 years later.
Yeah, I always love a movie that can have so much impact but is so economical in the filmmaking. It's just like no fluff. no nonsense. Jumping right into the grave robbing scene was fantastic. We're just, okay, boom, we're here with these guys. We're going on this adventure and let's see where it takes us. But how crazy must that have been way back then to see something as ghoulish as you open the film with a grave robbery? That's got to be pretty intense. I was wondering as I'm watching it again last night, man, people sitting in the theater who paid money to see this have no idea what they're in for. And then the first thing you see is that. Some people watch these older films like, oh, it's not that scary or it's not that. Yeah, but in the time that it came out, that wasn't like a normal thing. It's still not normal today. You shouldn't be going out robbing graves. But like to think we've become desensitized to a lot of these violent, horrific acts that happen on a daily basis. But back then, that must have been wild for people to see that. So right there, the audience is probably sucked in.
The fact that we go straight to the point at the beginning of the movie, it makes us understand the mentality of Frankenstein, because he's obsessed about what he wants to do. And from the very beginning, you understand it by his reaction, his performance, but also the fact that even yourself as an audience, you're right into the story. I think it's also why they wanted that to be so from the beginning, to understand the urge he had to create life.
Yes, he's a scientist, and they say that that he was brilliant, but he started to go a little bit too far, and he started to go on the fringe of things, and the university kind of pulls away from him, and he starts locking himself up in this tower and doing his own thing. That's all we need to know. And then you show me the bells and whistles when things are lighting up and there's lightning hitting, and that's it. I don't need to see him connecting cables and sitting there and measuring things. No, give it to me. And they did, and it works.
Well, the other interesting thing is the film actually starts with a warning.
Right.
The grave robbing scene is really the second scene. The first scene is the producer coming out and like telling the audience, like, you're going to see some crazy stuff.
Which is such a cool thing to think about back then.
Well, now there are ratings.
Right. Yeah, because back then, right, there's no social media. There's no 5-minute long trailers that show you every part of the movie before you get to the theater. So people are going to see Frankenstein. And you don't know what you're going to see until you get in there. Man, I envy that about the old days where you could I'm just going to go see the story, see what happens. Because I don't want to know anything. I want to be surprised.
Yeah, well, I think James Whale, the director, really kind of brought this story to life. And Boris Karloff, he had been working for like 10 years in films up to that point, and he really wasn't having tremendous success. This was really kind of his breakout film. I think in the same year, he was in Scarface, the original Scarface, directed by Howard Hawks, produced by Howard Hughes. But he's not a big significant role, and it was after he was Frankenstein's monster. Surprisingly, like, he kind of got typecast, but like in an excellent way, because he had this tremendous career. Boris Karloff is really one of my favorite classical actors. I really love watching him in a variety of different things, because a lot like Vincent Price, he's synonymous with the horror genre, but within the genre, he can go in a lot of different directions, and he can be the bad guy, he can be the good guy, he can be the crazy guy, he can be the subtle guy, and there's a lot of range displayed throughout his career. But they made a movie about James Whale called Gods and Monsters, starring Sir Ian McKellen and Brendan Fraser, and it's a pretty interesting film in and of itself. It kind of taps into the later years of his life, but they have flashbacks to the productions of Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein. But he's a director that really kind of broke a lot of ground and pioneered a legacy you don't really hear a whole lot about. When you think about like classic directors, like James Whale's name it's known to horror fans, but kind of falls by the wayside. But here we are almost 100 years later talking about his work, admiring his work. And honestly, this film, Frankenstein, really holds up, and you can see just the impact that it's had on directors like Tim Burton and even Guillermo del Toro. Like, this film has such a vast wave of influence, and a lot of it comes from James Whale, because as the director, he's responsible for what you're seeing on the screen.
The legacy of the movie, it's monstrous. It really is. It's a classic, so you kind of take it for granted. But when you go back and you sit and you watch it for 70 minutes, you get why it still reverberates through everything in pop culture. Like almost 100 years later,
Regarding James Wells, I checked out his work before being a filmmaker, and I discovered that he worked for theaters before as a set designer, and I think it shows in the movie. I think this movie is quite theatrical. Many scenes, especially when it's alive. I think it's really theatrical the way it is shot, and the sets also. I was really impressed because you can see that. I mean, I guess many sets were done in studios, but it has an atmosphere, especially the cemetery at the beginning. You see it's not a real cemetery, but you want to, I mean, maybe I'm a creepy one, but I wanted to be with them in this cemetery. I think I like the set. I like the atmosphere. I think it's pretty cool.
The atmosphere in this movie is awesome, to say the least.
An important point on the fact that this movie marked many generations is the makeup, because maybe it's not as good as we can have right now in modern movies, but it's quite exceptional for a movie made in the 30s. The monster, apparently what you said in the VHS, Pete, is that we don't have the same kind of monster in the book and in the movie. So I guess they had to really create a monster when they decided what kind of makeup is going to be made for this film. And I think it makes a good job, really. It's quite credible, and it's amazing for the time period.
Yeah, Jack Pierce is the makeup artist on this film, and he created the look of Frankenstein. He also did The Mummy with Boris Karloff the following year. He did The Wolfman. He was the universal monster makeup guy. And really he's a pioneer in that particular realm. You know, in the early days, actors would just do their own makeup. There wasn't really a designated makeup effects artist or guy or department. Like Lon Chaney Sr., he would do his own makeup when he was Phantom of the Opera or Hunchback of Notre Dame. Even Charlie Chaplin would do his own makeup, and it was up to the actors to just take care of themselves. And that transferred over from vaudeville.
The fact that somebody can come up with that many iconic looks is astounding. So Jack Pierce, man, hats off, dude, because that's a massive legacy to have.
Well, the other thing that I think is really kind of fascinating that adds to this film years later, you know, it wasn't a thought at the time, but looking back, the fact that this film is in black and white and just dealing with the themes of this story, it's like the world is not black and white. There's a gray area that we all live in and exist in, but the morals that are tied into this story and good versus evil, heroes and villains, Steve, you had mentioned this as well. It's like it really kind of blends in that gray area. And so just looking back at it retrospectively, the fact that this film, this version is in black and white and it still resonates and holds up, I think there's a subtle, maybe subconscious tie to the ideas in this story coming through the black and white presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. The scene where Henry wants to show the monster light, just the fact that they got that much contrast when the roof shutter opens and then Carl looking up, you know, it's like a baby seeing something for the first time, and you're watching this this monster come to life, who's not really a monster, you know, which is the funny thing. It's like he's got this abnormal brain, and he's you know, a mixture of all these different people who were once alive, but he doesn't set out to be evil. It's just he has the guidance is not there, you know.
Well, it makes you question, like, what is a monster and who is the monster? Just because you put the label on the character, oh, that's the monster, he's monstrous, he's monster, and it's like, but you're the ones who are attacking him. You're the ones who are tormenting him. You are the monsters. And that becomes another trope in the genre, you know, like even in the Twilight Zone, the monsters on Maple Street.
Yeah.
You know, who's really the monster? And The Thing, there's a monster among us, and who's the monster? And it's like, you don't know. There's more to it than a visual or physical presentation. I think that's one of the things about this film that I really love, is how it kind of plays with the audience's expectations and the audience's perceptions.
Yeah, what's funny is, so when you think about, like, James Whale, his direction on this, he kind of sets the bar extremely high for horror films, right, going forward. The makeup sets the bar incredibly high. The production value sets the bar incredibly high. So you're firing on all cylinders here. You know, they haven't missed yet. And it's remarkable. The central core of the story is still impactful today also. What's a monster, who's a monster, what's going too far, the God complex, morality, not nurturing or being nurtured in the right way. These are themes that still carry over.
Because you knew this movie before doing this podcast, but for me it's a discovery. So because maybe I'm uncultured in movie, to see such movie made in the 30s talking about those kind of topics, and because I wanted to talk about the laboratory of Frankenstein, the machine you see and the technology used, I didn't expect that in the 30s. I was really surprised. Nowadays it's quite the same, but you put computers, so it's really impressive. And as Steve said, it's they put such a high level in this movie that of course they inspired the others after, but yeah, it's definitely a masterpiece that people who likes horror movies or black and white movies, they must see this movie for that. But talking about the topics, it's still very relevant nowadays. It's still question that we have, like life beyond death. It's something that's quite all science fiction movies nowadays talk about. And who am I, why am I here? Because it's also the topics, I feel so bad for the monster when they try to get rid of it. Why they created it, it's unfair. The victim actually is the monster at the end. You created someone with that telling him what to do, how to behave. Maybe they didn't have the right time to do so, but it's not his fault. Even Maria's death, even if it's a tragedy, I feel bad for this guy anyway. He didn't understand what he did. So when you create a human being, if the human being behaves badly, is that your fault? It's also a question in this movie.
Yeah, it's funny how this film has affected the legacy and the story of Frankenstein, because and at its core it's still the same thing, but there's so much in this film because it's a visual presentation of the story that it impacts people instantly. Like you look at words on a page, and unless you're actually reading them, they're not going to impact you. But you look at an image and you're going to see all the stuff in that image instantly, and it's going to impact you.
It's kind of amazing. I hadn't really thought about it in that aspect before.
And now a word from our sponsor.
This podcast is brought to you by Visually Hidden Selects. If you're looking for a spoiler-free recommendation of a classic film with professional analysis and insight, check out Visually Hidden Selects, exclusively on the Visually Hidden YouTube channel.
One thing that really kind of stands out about this film, because you had mentioned earlier about being an audience member in 1931 and seeing this for the first time, and think about, we start off with the warning and then we go right into grave robbing. Okay. And then here comes the monster.
Reanimating dead tissue.
Yeah, but then when the monster gets loose and he goes to the village and he encounters little Maria, imagine what audiences reacted to when they first saw Frankenstein pick up little Maria and throw her in the water and then panic and run away. And then, 5 minutes later, the father's carrying her corpse through the village.
People are just like going about their day, and then they stop and everyone turns to look and see, oh my God, what's happened to this child? And just, he's got no expression. It's like he's been murdered. That's like the gut punch. And then it rallies the entire village to get the torches and the pitchforks and let's go get this guy. And it's like Henry then joins the mob to stop this guy, but Henry's the one who's responsible for unleashing this thing, so it's like Henry almost kind of like absolves himself in that moment. He's like, the creature must be stopped, but you're kind of the creature. You created this monster in this situation, and it's almost like that thing nowadays with serial killers will join the manhunt for the kid. It's kind of like that mentality. Like he distanced himself away from this action. I'm just going to be part of the solution, but like you're the problem,
For me, that echoes to God actions also, because people think that God creates us and has the power of death on us. So when you create a criminal, why don't you kill it? You know what I'm saying? It's because he said when Frankenstein created the monster, he said it's alive. It's kind of I'm a god now. And what you just said, it's also something that people can think, if God exists, why it created this monster. You know what I'm saying? So it echoes to God again, not just the fact that he created life, but also the fact that he has to react to the bad behavior of what he created.
Yeah. also there's the free will aspect of things, right? Henry has this free will and he maximizes it and does exactly what he wants. Consequences be damned. And then tries to just like, yeah, we got to stop this guy. Forget it. Forget about who made him. Let's just hand me that torch, And you're like, I'm not saying that Henry doesn't feel anything at all in the movie, but he just goes right to hero mode and like, I'm going to lead this group of people.
No, he feels guilty, I think.
Yeah, he sees the error of his ways and he realizes like, oh, this is a failed experiment and now I have to control this. He had very, very high hopes for this idea, and when it implodes, and it really is with the death of Fritz where he's realized like, oh man, this is not what I wanted. This is not my goal. This was not what I was striving for. At that point, then he kind of realized like, okay, yeah, something has to happen with this monster that I've made. And that's why he's so reluctant to participate in the sequel in Bride of Frankenstein. Dr. Pretorius pretty much has to like blackmail and like hold him hostage to participate in it because he
strong arm him too.
He wants that glory and he feels like he can perfect it based on his own experiments. But Dr. Frankenstein at that point, he knows better. And so he's so reluctant. And then I think it's very beautiful the way it all comes around at the end of Bride of Frankenstein and the realization that the monster has when the bride sees him and there's still no connection there, no love. And he's like, we belong dead. That's such a beautiful line.
Yeah. And he sacrifices himself for the doctor. Let's talk about that performance for a second. I mean, Colin Clive, he's got that look of the old school silver screen, debonair kind of a guy with the slicked back hair and whatever. But then in the drop of a dime, the eyes go cold and it's alive. He gets, and that's talk about one of the most iconic lines of cinema, not just horror, but cinema ever.
Yeah.
The it's alive. And his commitment to that line, he seems like possessed, like, he like crazed and like just
the frantic shaking in his body, like his body language in that moment is so like,
his knees go weak. They're like, holding him up. He's like,
you believe every single molecule of that man.
But he sells it, man. He sells it so good.
I remember when I first saw this and like Colin Clive, he really kind of stood out to me and like I was a little sad that he didn't have like more of a career. Like, I mean, he had a career, but it really wasn't like, he didn't have as good a career as Boris Karloff.
Right. Yeah.
And you would want at least that for him from this film and this performance. He's just phenomenal.
And to your point, how scary he looks when he's possessed by his own abilities and his own power and his own dream of creating life. And then the hopelessness in Frankenstein's face. So like at moments, Henry looks more like the monster, quote unquote, the monster than the monster does, and how Henry in his obsession with this goal loses his humanity a bit. And then Frankenstein starts to discover it when he realizes how he wronged Maria. So it's a really interesting dynamic and how those two guys switch things.
Well, and that's why I don't think it's a big deal to call the monster Frankenstein because they are kind of synonymous.
I agree. I've never, I understand the argument, but agree to disagree. We can call him Frankenstein.
But all the film long, I never seen a madman in Frankenstein. Maybe I'm a creepy girl, that's why. But I see, someone really obsessed about what he wants to do, what he wants to achieve. And I think it's beautiful to be so obsessed when you believe in something. And as you said, he's kind of a monster sometimes. But I love the chemistry he has with the monster when he tries to teach him how to sit down. And there's a chemistry in a way, even if they don't really share lines. There's something. I'm more impressed about this chemistry than the one he's supposed to have with his fiancée. I'm not saying that it's not a good acting, but I think the chemistry is less there than with the monster itself.
Yeah, well, I think he proved that he was more enamored with his work than he was with her. He just leaves her.
Yeah, maybe. That's
locks himself in the tower. I'll be back. You sit tight. Don't you worry. I'll be back in time for the wedding. And he's like, but I got to do this. This is what's really important. And Victor's like, I'm always here for you. He's like ready to swoop in, like Henry, fuck up just once and I'll take your woman.
Yeah, but I don't remember if we talked about it, but the fact that everything turns bad because Fritz messed up with the brains, for me, it's kind of a deliberated act, I think maybe. I think you said that already, Pete, but maybe it's an act of jealousy because it was the disabled handyman of Frankenstein. And with a new creature, maybe he feels in danger that it could be replaced in a way. So I think it's interesting to see that aspect of this character. And also, it's one of the funniest character in this movie. I noticed that in this one and The Bride of Frankenstein, you always have a funny character. And for me, Fritz and maybe the Baron Frankenstein are the two funny elements in this movie. And in The Bride of Frankenstein, you have Minnie, the servant. She's pretty funny from the beginning of the movie. So that's interesting in that kind of movie to have the funny character, because we said that this movie is really a masterpiece, but that's what we said in many other movies we talked about. When you have action, drama, horror, and fun, it's definitely a complete movie.
Yeah, and Dwight Frye, who plays Fritz, he does turn up in Bride of Frankenstein as a completely different character. He's one of the henchmen at the end who's helping Pretorius. And Dwight Frye, he also was Renfield in Dracula. So he's just a very good character actor. He's not a star, but through his different characters, he has become known for his craft. And really, I think Fritz is probably his most iconic and biggest contribution to cinema history, because again, the character isn't in the book. He's part of the stage adaptation, and then he's just carried forward through the years where he's kind of been misappropriated as a Igor. But really, when you trace it back, Fritz is the origin of that hunchback helper of Dr. Frankenstein.
One thing Anne said that just sparked a thought for me was, Fritz, whether he did or didn't do it on purpose, he felt, I think, a certain amount of maybe neglect from Henry. And then you have Elizabeth in that relationship, and there's a neglect there. Like, he's not there for her. And then to an extent, like, yes, he tries to school the monster and try to teach him and whatever. But then the other doctor says to him, you know what, Henry, you need to go relax. I'll take care of him. I'll dispose of the monster. And there's that neglect there that Henry walks away from. He's like, okay. And he didn't take care of his own problem. And then the problem gets out, like kills that doctor, kills Maria. So it's like Henry's neglect in his relationships leads to like a lot of problems. And it's like his tunnel vision for the goal is fantastic. He's right there with it. But then everything else in his, around that falls to pieces.
One thing that I find really interesting about this film as well, we talk about all of these other films, right? And one thing that is a constant in pretty much every single film that we've ever discussed in the VHS series is the music. And this film doesn't have a score. Scores were not commonplace. Dracula also does not have a score, an original score. In the 90s, they put a score into the original Dracula, but Frankenstein does not have a score. Bride of Frankenstein has a score, but Frankenstein really plays without any musical accompaniment or swells or cues or anything. The only music in this film is diegetic music that exists in the world, which is primarily when the father is carrying Maria through the village and you hear, that band playing in the background. But really, there's no score or theme for this film. And that's kind of fascinating when you think about how much we associate the emotional investment of the characters into the music. And here's one with none of that. And yet we are deep into these characters.
That's an excellent point. Because I always say that one of the things I hate in modern day horror movies is where the music cue tells me where I should be scared or I should feel suspense. I feel like it's a crutch and it's not necessary. And clearly you could see something like Frankenstein and still take away everything you were supposed to take away or whatever, James Whale intended you to take away from it without the overblown musical cues. But yeah, it's a very interesting thing that this movie doesn't have a score, and yet you don't miss it. You don't even think about it. Like, oh, well, how come there's no music here? It's not even a question, which is a very interesting thing.
Yeah, the emotions in the film really comes from the action you have on screen, and to get the example you gave, Pete, with the father with his daughter's body in his hand. When you think about it, he enters a celebration. There is a celebration in the village, in the town. So I love the contradiction between the father who is desperate to have his daughter's body in his hand, and the town that stops celebrating because a drama just happened. So that's why you're so into the movie, is because of the action that creates the emotion. And that's the same for every key moments. Like when he says it's alive, it's alive, you're so into the intensity of the scene, the excitement of Frankenstein, that you forget that there is no music, you don't need any. You have the action that brings you the emotion.
Yeah, I think it really just kind of helps it like hit harder without the music, because like there's no music in life, like we aren't walking down the street or driving around and all of a sudden, unless you're playing it, there's no like music just happening to dictate your life or your feelings or your actions. And so I think in a weird kind of way, it helps this film hit a little bit harder. And so then it stays with you a little bit longer. It goes a little bit deeper. It's, it's not common, but I think it's a strength of this particular film.
I agree.
But yeah, as I said in the video, I love the scene when we first meet the monster and Henry shows him the sunlight, the way they both play that, because it starts with Henry talking about it, and then they bring in the monster and he turns around slowly and you just get that reveal, and then those like quick, close like cuts like into his face, and it's like, holy shit, yeah, that guy's fucking scary. Yeah. And then how it develops and just the way Karloff uses his hands, to like try to like
yeah,
like a wounded animal almost, or a newborn, like he can't really communicate. And then Fritz comes along and just fucks it all up.
Well, you've got the "It's alive," right? One of the most iconic lines ever. But there's so many iconic shots in this movie. The reveal of Frankenstein, the windmill on fire, the farmer carrying Maria, Frankenstein kneeling down by the water with Maria, with the flowers. That's, another iconic thing.
Even just the body rising through the lab.
This film has inspired other horror films. It's inspired horror comedies, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, right? Or Young Frankenstein, which is kind of like the adopted son sequel. And then you see the influence in so many other films. There's touches of it in, things like Megan, even Jurassic Park, right? The theme of getting so focused on creating something that we don't even think about the consequences. Like the famous Ian Malcolm line, you're so preoccupied with whether or not you could, you can stop and think whether or not you should. And that's kind of what this is. So yeah, has a really remarkable reach, and then of course Tim Burton is.
Yeah, well, Edward Scissorhands right off the bat, and Frankenweenie.
Yeah, it's so many, great stories that have come and spawned, I think, mostly because of the film.
And a lot of those films in their own right they're inspired, but they're inspired. They're not
copies or ripoffs, cheap ripoffs.
Yeah, and even still, it's like, well, yeah, because Frankenstein is such a classic story at this point. It's like we could go make Frankenstein right now. Like, it's not going to replace it, but it's just going to add to that legacy.
There was one that came out, I think, just this year. I haven't seen it yet. Lisa Frankenstein, which people are saying was great. Then there's crazy B movies from like the 80s, Frankenhooker. So there's so many.
Yeah, that's the lasting legacy is Frankenhooker. Let's leave it there. It's such a beautiful film. It really holds up. And like I said, like I'll still watch this movie, and there's always something to enjoy, whether I'm focusing on the performances or the production design or anything, the cinematography. It all still holds up and it all still delivers, and there's still more to learn from watching this film and more to appreciate or take away. And even in terms of the themes, like we've been discussing, there's so much substance in this story and in this film. And then if you want to tack on Bride of Frankenstein as the conclusion, it really just has so much to offer audiences in a way that other films don't. And I think part of it is like, even though you may only have seen a more recent version of Frankenstein, there's something about this one that when you actually do go and watch it, the other ones kind of become a little bit watered down, because this one is the original. It is so potent and so pure and so strong. Like it's in my top 10 favorite horror films of all
Yeah.
time. It's just such a beautiful little dark fairy tale. I think that's what makes it kind of timeless.
Yeah.
That will about do it for us here today at the Visually Hidden Selects podcast. We will be discussing a completely different film next time, so be sure to head over to our YouTube channel and subscribe so you don't miss any future recommendations. You can catch Stephen Bendler on Instagram over at Steve's Pop Culture Corner. Anne and I, of course, are also on Instagram as well as Letterboxd, so you can follow us over there and find out what we've been watching and see what we think. And until next time, don't play God.